My name is Naomi Reyes Whitfield. I was 29 when I understood, for the first time in my adult life, what it felt like to disappear inside my own kitchen. It didn't happen with shouting. It happened with a scrape, the dull, deliberate sound of a fork pushing food off a plate and into a trash can in front of me, without a single word of explanation. I had spent 40 minutes on that dinner. Braised short ribs, the recipe my mother used to make on Sundays when my father still came home early enough to eat with us. I remember standing at the stove with the window cracked, letting in the smell of late autumn, thinking that maybe tonight would be different. Maybe Daniel would notice the effort. Maybe he'd ask about my day the way he used to, back when we were two people building something instead of two people occupying the same square footage. He came in at 8:40, an hour later than he'd said, still in his blazer, scrolling through his phone with the particular blankness he reserved only for me. I set the plate down. He looked at it the way you'd look at something a stranger had left on your porch. "I already ate," he said.
Not sorry.
Not even bothered. Just a fact, delivered flatly like a weather report. Then he picked up the plate himself, walked to the trash can, and scraped the ribs and the rice and the roasted carrots into it. The lid closed with a soft thud that somehow felt louder than any door I'd ever heard slammed. I didn't cry. That surprised me most of all. I stood there with the dish towel still in my hand, and something in my chest simply went quiet, the way a room goes quiet after a clock stops ticking. I realized I had been waiting for a moment like this for a long time without admitting it to myself, waiting for the small cruelty that would finally be undeniable, the one I couldn't explain away as him being tired or stressed or just Daniel being Daniel. I thought about my mother that night, lying awake beside a man who came home smelling like someone else's perfume for 6 years before she finally said something. I used to promise myself I'd never let a house go that quiet around me. And yet here I was, 29 years old, in a kitchen that still smelled like rosemary and rejection, watching the woman I'd become stand very still and start, for the first time, to actually think. Not react.
Think.
I didn't confront him that night. I didn't throw anything, didn't raise my voice, didn't demand an apology I already knew wouldn't come honestly. Instead, I washed the pan. I wiped the counter. I did the small, ordinary things a wife does at the end of an evening, and underneath every motion, something in me was quietly closing a door that had been open far too long. Daniel went to bed, without a word. I stayed in the kitchen a while longer, staring at the closed lid of the trash can, and I thought about the folder in my desk drawer upstairs, the one I'd started 3 months earlier, back when I first noticed the late nights, the phone turned face down on the table, the sudden showers before bed on days he swore he'd been in meetings. I hadn't been ready to open that folder. That night, standing in a kitchen that smelled like a dinner nobody would ever eat, I finally was. I met Daniel Whitfield when I was 23, fresh out of graduate school, working my first real job as a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm downtown. He was charming in the specific way that later, in hindsight, I recognized as rehearsed, attentive at first, generous with compliments, quick to remember small details about my life that made me feel, for a while, genuinely seen. We married 2 years later. My mother cried at the wedding, not from joy alone, but from something more complicated, a hope, I think now, that my life would look different from hers. For a long time it did. Daniel built a career in commercial real estate. I kept climbing at the firm. We bought a house with a kitchen I loved, the kind with good light in the mornings, and for a few years it was enough. The shift was so gradual I could never point to a single day it began. A missed dinner became a pattern. Compliments turned into comments about my weight, my moods, my habit of always needing something from him. I started shrinking my own needs down to a size that wouldn't inconvenience him, the way you learn, without meaning to walk quietly through a house where someone else's comfort has quietly become the only priority that matters. My sister Priya used to ask me, gently, whether I was happy. I always said yes too fast. I've thought about that a lot since, how quickly I could lie to the person who loved me most, just to avoid admitting something to myself. The folder in my desk drawer had started small, a receipt from a restaurant I'd never been to, a hotel confirmation email he'd forgotten to delete from our shared calendar, a pattern of withdrawals from an account I didn't know he'd opened. I hadn't gone looking for those things. I'd simply stopped looking away from them. I am not, by nature, a vengeful person. I've never wanted to hurt anyone, not even the people who hurt me. But somewhere in that year of small erasures, the missed calls returned late, the birthday he forgot, and then acted wounded about my disappointment, I stopped confusing my patience with weakness, and I stopped confusing his comfort with my responsibility. The night of the ribs was not the beginning of my anger. It was the end of my performance of not having any. I didn't file for divorce in a single dramatic afternoon. That's not how these things actually happen, no matter how they're told in stories. It took 3 weeks of quiet, careful mornings early before Daniel woke, sitting at my laptop with coffee going cold beside me, gathering documents, forwarding bank statements to my own private email, taking photographs of things I might need to remember later. I met with a lawyer named Constance Yuba, a woman in her 50s with a steady voice and reading glasses that she wore low on her nose, who looked at the folder I brought her and said only, "You've done more of my job than most clients do in months." I don't know why that small validation meant so much to me. Maybe because for over a year, no one had told me I was doing anything right. I didn't tell Daniel what I was building. I kept cooking dinner some nights, still going through the motions of a marriage that existed, on his end, mostly in name. I wasn't performing forgiveness. I was performing patience, the strategic kind, the kind that waits for solid ground before it moves. There's a particular loneliness in living beside someone while quietly preparing to leave them. You laugh at the same jokes. You still ask about their day. And underneath all of it, you are building an exit, plank by plank, in complete silence, because you've learned that announcing your pain to someone who's stopped caring only gives them one more way to dismiss it. I thought, often, about what my mother never had, a way out that didn't cost her everything. I had my own income. I had a sister who would take my calls at midnight without judgment. I had, for the first time in a long while, myself. The papers were ready on a Tuesday. I remember it was raining, one of those gray afternoons where the whole city seems to be holding its breath. I placed the folder on the kitchen table, the same table where he'd scraped my dinner into the trash, and I waited for him to come home. He noticed the folder before he noticed me. That told me everything I needed to know about where his attention had lived for the past year. "What is this?" he asked, already irritated, as though my existence had become an inconvenience he hadn't budgeted time for. "Everything," I said. "Everything you thought I wasn't paying attention to." I watched his face move through several expressions in quick succession, confusion, then something closer to fear, though he tried to cover it with practiced indignation. He opened the folder. I watched him read the hotel confirmations, the messages I'd printed, the account statements with a name on them that wasn't mine. He didn't apologize. Not at first. He tried, instead, to reframe it, to tell me I'd misunderstood, that I was always looking for something to be upset about, the same script he'd used for a year to convince me my own perception couldn't be trusted. But something had changed in me since the night of the ribs. I no longer needed him to confirm what I already knew to be true. "I'm not here for an argument," I told him, and my voice, to my own surprise, stayed even. "I'm here to tell you I've filed. The papers are in that folder too." He said my name the way you'd say it to someone you were trying to talk down from a ledge, as though my calm was the unreasonable thing in the room, not the year of erasures that preceded it. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt. I had learned, finally, that I didn't need to win an argument with a man who had never once, in a year, fought fair. When he finally ran out of things to say, I stood, collected the folder, and told him I'd be staying with my sister until the house was settled. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice. I simply left the kitchen the way I'd left so many rooms in that marriage, quietly, and for the last time. Priya's apartment smelled like the candles she always burned, sandalwood and something citrus underneath. She didn't ask me a single question that first night. She just made tea, set it in front of me, and sat close enough that I could feel she was there without needing to say so. It was 2 days before I cried. Not for Daniel, I want to be honest about that, but for the years I'd spent convincing myself that shrinking was the same thing as loving someone well. I cried for the dinners I'd cooked for a man who'd stopped seeing me as a person somewhere along the way, and for the version of myself who had once believed that was simply what marriage required. Grief, I learned, doesn't always look like missing someone. Sometimes it looks like mourning the time you spent trying to be enough for someone who is never going to notice. My mother called on the third day. I hadn't told her yet, but she'd heard from Priya, and instead of the lecture I braced for, she said only, "I wish I'd done what you did, 20 years sooner." I hadn't expected that. I hadn't expected the quiet pride in her voice, either. As though something in her own long-buried grief had finally been answered by my decision, even secondhand. I went back to work the following Monday. My colleagues didn't know. I sat through meetings, ran the same numbers I always ran, and felt, underneath the ordinary rhythm of the day, something unfamiliar beginning to take shape. Not happiness yet, but its early architecture. Room, for the first time in a long time, to simply exist without managing someone else's moods around me. Daniel texted twice that week. Both times I read the messages and set the phone down without responding. I wasn't punishing him. I had simply run out of interest in explaining myself to a man who had never once asked how I was doing without an agenda attached to the question. The settlement took 4 months. Constance was precise and unhurried, the kind of lawyer who never raised her voice because she never needed to. Daniel tried, at various points, to paint himself as the wronged party, a man who'd simply made mistakes, who deserved a chance to work on things. But paperwork, unlike memory, doesn't bend to convenient narratives. I didn't ask for revenge in the settlement. I asked for what was fair and let the facts speak for themselves. There is a particular kind of justice in refusing to be cruel to someone who is cruel to you, not because they deserve your mercy, but because you refuse to let their smallness define the shape of who you become. He lost more than money in that process, though I never once tried to take anything beyond what was rightfully mine. He lost the version of himself he'd been performing for years, the successful, composed man who always had control of the room. In the deposition, Constance told me later, he seemed smaller than she expected. Defensive. Uncertain. A man discovering, perhaps for the first time, that his comfort had never actually been guaranteed. I felt no triumph watching that unfold, only a quiet, sober relief, the kind that comes not from someone else's downfall, but from your own refusal to keep disappearing for their sake. Word got around, as it always does. A cousin of his mentioned, at a wedding I wasn't invited to but heard about anyway, that Daniel had grown quieter since the divorce, more withdrawn. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. I felt, mostly, distance, the particular piece of no longer being tethered to how a person's life unfolds after you. I moved into a small apartment that spring, one with a kitchen half the size of the one I'd left, but with morning light so generous it felt like an apology from the universe for everything before it. I painted the walls a pale sage green, the color my mother always said reminded her of new beginnings, though she'd never explained why until that year. I cooked for myself the way I used to cook for us, slow, careful meals, the kind that take an evening to make and a moment to eat. The first time I made those short ribs again alone in my own kitchen, I sat at my small table and ate every bite, unhurried, unwatched, unafraid of anyone scraping it into a trash can. It wasn't dramatic. There was no swelling music, no cinematic realization. Just a woman, eating a meal she'd made with her own hands, in a home that finally, fully, belonged to her. Priya came over most Sundays. My mother visited twice that summer, and both times she stood in my kitchen a little longer than necessary, running her hand along the counter as though she were memorizing something she'd waited her whole life to witness, her daughter, whole, in a home built entirely on her own terms. I didn't date for a long while. I wasn't in a hurry to hand my piece to anyone new. I spent those months instead learning the specific, quiet joy of a life that asked nothing of me except my own honesty. A year later, almost to the day, I stood in that same small kitchen, making dinner again, not for anyone waiting on the other side of a door, not for approval, not for the fragile hope that effort might finally be enough to earn someone's attention. I made it because I wanted to, because the smell of rosemary in a quiet apartment had become, for me, a kind of prayer. I think often about that night the ribs went into the trash, not with bitterness anymore, but with something closer to gratitude. It was the moment a door I'd been holding open out of habit finally, mercifully closed. Not because I was strong enough to slam it shut in anger, but because I was finally honest enough to admit it had already been closing for years. I don't know what Daniel's life looks like now, and I've stopped needing to. Some people, I've learned, only exist to teach you the exact shape of what you'll never accept again. I set the table for one that night, the way I do most evenings now, though sometimes it's for 2 or 3 when Priya or my mother comes by, and the table fills with a kind of warmth I used to mistake for something only other families got to have. I lit a candle. I sat down. I ate slowly, the way you eat a meal that no one, ever again, will scrape into a trash can while you watch. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, I understood something I wished I'd known years earlier, that the most powerful kind of justice isn't the kind that punishes someone else. It's the kind that simply, finally, lets you come home to yourself. Naomi's story isn't really about a ruined dinner. It's about the moment she stopped shrinking herself to keep someone else comfortable. Real justice, in the end, wasn't loud or cruel. It was quiet, patient, and completely hers. If her story moved you, sit with this question for a second. How long would you wait before choosing yourself? If this story touched something in you, hit like and subscribe. New cinematic stories like Naomi's drop every week. Drop a comment below. What would you have done the night the dinner hit the trash? And if you know someone who needs to hear that walking away can be its own kind of victory, share this video with them.